the corpus of hadith is not the proof for everything in Islam. And that gives you your next category of proof, which is called qiyas, analogical reasoning. A large portion of Sharia, and a lot of Muslims don't know this, a large portion of Sharia or sacred law is actually not directly from Qur'an or hadith. It actually comes out of human understandings. Now, who do we trust? We trust people that, first of all, the Prophet ﷺ said that the best generation are my generation in understanding of Islam and behavior according to it, are my generation, and then the next generation, and then the next generation. Well, that third generation ends with these groups of imams. They're the last group. So they are called the people who wrote everything down. The people before them were the people who heard it from the Sahaba, and the Sahaba were people who lived it. So each generation is less adherent to the tradition than the one that preceded it. And that's why the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, no time will come except the time that follows it is worse than it, until you meet your Lord. And what that means is each generation they're less understanding, less practicing, and less aware of God. The ulama say that in every generation there's always exceptions. So you'll have somebody in a generation that might actually be better than some of the scholars that preceded him, more knowledgeable, things like that. But they will still not be from a generation. The best generation were the first three. So that does not negate the possibility of individuals coming later that are great people, like the people who went before. But as large numbers of people, that disappears. And it increasingly does so until the Prophet ﷺ said, people will have sex in open public places. And the best people in those days will say, would you go do that somewhere else? And there's a hadith that says that. So things get morally worse and all of these things. So this is happening now. The madhab is when you have a hadith that is open to several interpretations. And most words by their nature can have more than one interpretation. If the imams differed on it, then because they've reached a level which is called ijtihad mutlaq, where you reach a level of absolute ability to determine or derive legal rulings. And that doesn't mean you can't be wrong, but it means that you're so knowledgeable you have the authority to be wrong. Because somebody who's a fool, even if he's right, he's wrong. Whereas somebody who is very brilliant and very humble and capable of his limitations, which these men were, then even when he's wrong, he's still right. Because he's basing it on deep deliberation. He's basing it on thought. He's not basing it on opinions or on foolishness or on, no. His judgment has arrived out of serious effort. And it's very different when you meet somebody who holds an opinion because he read it in Time or Newsweek and somebody who holds an opinion because he really thoroughly studied the subject. I mean, you feel much safer either way, whether you're pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. If you meet somebody who's really thoroughly examined the issue, he has weight and authority. But if somebody just reads the headlines and then he's going to spout his opinions, then he's a fool, and it's a fool who takes his opinion seriously. I mean, that's the reality of it. And that's why the Qur'an says, هَلْ يَسْتَوِيَ الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Are they the same, those who know and those who don't know? They're not the same. Even when they're wrong, they're not the same. Somebody who's wrong, who is speaking out of knowledge, is not the same as somebody who's right, who's speaking out of ignorance. You're still safer with the one who's wrong with deep knowledge and understanding. And the thing about these people is they'll never be way off because they know the principles. One of the things that the ancients, particularly the Greeks, had this understanding, that if you understood the universals, the particulars would take care of themselves. One of the things about modern men and women is that they're obsessed with particulars and they know nothing of universals. And so when you know al-qaida al-amma, right, if you have that general principle, you're not going to make big mistakes in the particulars, in the juz'iyat. You just won't make big mistakes. If you know that it is a general rule, la darara wa la dirar. There is no harming and there is no reciprocation of harm. That's a principle in Islam. If you know that principle, that's going to save you from a lot of problems. If you know the principle al-umur bi maqasidiha, that matters are based upon the intentions behind them, that is going to affect how you view people's actions. If you understand the principle al-mashaqqatu tajlibu taysir, duress necessitates facilitation or ease. That when people are under stressful conditions, you need to help them by making things easier in order to remove that stress, because people in stressful situations will begin to break down mentally. So that is why rulings will change in times of great difficulty. So a scholar who knows that, like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, he has opinions that other scholars don't see it, because he knows the universal. So when he moves into the particulars, he knows how to work with them in a different way. Whereas there are people that learn the particulars of Sharia. They memorize all the rules. For A, do B. For C, do D. And so when they see that's what you do. Well, is that always in every situation? Do you see? So there's a very big difference between people who have this, and this is what these imams were famous for. They were famous for this vast understanding of the philosophy behind the Sharia, the legislation. They understood, one, that Sharia is for human benefit. And therefore, if they found things that were harmful to people, even though the law said to do it, they would change the law. So, and that's hard for a lot of Muslims to understand, because they've lost that flexibility. And intolerance generally comes from ignorance. I mean, that's at the root of intolerance. If you want to remove intolerance, you have to first remove ignorance with people. So the madhab are based on those differences of understanding. And so what I want to say about the jihad, there is a difference about what is the reason for jihad. Out of the four imams, Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, and Imam Ahmad believed that the reason that fighting was legislated was to remove aggression or belligerence. That was the illah, was what's called hiraba. Imam Shafi'i said no, it was to remove kufr. It was to get rid of kufr. Now, that's a big difference in understanding. Generally, in the history of Islam, the ruling governments followed the Hanafi and the Maliki madhab, which created an incredible tolerance for other peoples, non-Muslims. But even the Shafi'i, when they had authority, they basically applied the principle of the other imams. So even though that is the opinion of Imam Shafi'i, it was not the practice of the scholars of his madhab. As we move into Islam and Iman, what is the difference between Islam and Iman? Islam in the Arabic language comes from a root word salima. And salima means to be whole. It's the same root of the Jewish Hebrew word which they get shalom from, shalama. The idea is that salam is a wholeness. That when we speak of God as as-salam, that is a name of God, what it means is that God has no parts. Now, when you have wholeness, you have peace. But war comes about when you have divisiveness. Do you see how the understanding there of peace comes out of this understanding of wholeness? That if a people are whole, if there's an integrity in a people, then you won't have wars. But when a people become divisive, you get belligerence. And that is why, for instance, in Islam, generally, when they ruled, they believed that Jews and Christians and other religions had a right to live and practice amongst them with certain conditions. But they had that belief, it's in their religion. Whereas there are other religions that have ruled that didn't believe that. They actually believed they had no right at all. So that creates a very different type of society. It creates a divisiveness that leads to war. So the Muslims have always seen that. I mean, if you look at the human body, there are things on the body that do not serve a purpose for the body as a whole, but they're part of the body. You can have scars on your body. They're part of the body. You don't dig out further to get rid of the scar. You just leave it the way it is. So there's still a wholeness, even though it might not be something that you necessarily like or want there. But you tolerate it because it's part of the body. So traditionally, Muslims saw other religions not as co-religionists, but as co-human beings. They're human beings. We would rather they be Muslim, but they're part of the social body. And so we should tolerate them. And the Qur'an says even that they can be part of families, they can be married in the families, they should be treated with dignity, but even with kindness and friendship and these things. So the difference between Islam and Iman is that the word salima, which means whole, relates to the outward of Islam. When we say Islam, what we mean is an outward practice. And that's why a Muslim is anyone who basically says, I'm a Muslim. And the way that they say that is, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Anyone that says, there's no God but one God, and Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam is his messenger, is considered a Muslim. Whether he practices or not. That's enough to come into Islam. And then they're treated as a Muslim. They're buried as a Muslim. As long as they never reject that. Now, the more, according to the Islamic teaching, the more you practice with good intention, the stronger the Iman gets. So the Iman is the inward component. It's not something you can see. Islam you can see, basically. Iman is something that only God can see. That's the secret of Bani Adam, is this unseen element of faith. And that's why in the Qur'an, when the Arabs say, قَالَتِ الْعَرَابُ آمَنَّا, these desert Arabs came and they said to the Prophet, we believe. Allah said, don't say we believe, but say we have submitted. أسلمنا. لا تقولوا آمنا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا. We have submitted. وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ, because Iman has not yet come into your hearts. So the Qur'an clearly distinguishes between Islam and Iman. Now we can also see Islam though as a greater rubric that includes Iman and Ihsan. So it's looked as a specific, but it's also looked at as an inclusive word. Now, one of the things, he takes the Mu'tazilite approach here a little bit. I mean, generally the Sunni scholars believe that Iman was merely tasdeeq, which means to verify something in your heart, to believe it in your heart. That's all it was. And then there was a difference of opinion about whether you actually had to say it on your tongue. Obviously, if you were mute and couldn't speak, you didn't. But if you could, they said it was an obligation. And then action according to this, and this is a classic debate between Protestants and Catholics also. Is it faith and deeds that one is saved, or is it faith alone? And obviously the Protestant tradition says it is faith alone. The deeds don't come into it. In a sense, that's closer to the Islamic tradition in that particular aspect, is that the Muslims believe that faith alone in God is enough. Although there is an idea that there might be some purification in the next world for those people. So it's a very dangerous and precarious type condition to be in, where you have faith in your heart, but no deeds. Malik bin Dinar tells a story that he saw a funeral and he decided to go and help them bury this person. And he helped put him down into the grave. And it had a very powerful effect on him, which often does if you go to funerals. And Muslim funerals are particularly powerful because the body is just in cloth and it's not in a coffin. So you're putting a person right into the earth and then throwing dirt on them.